Hey there, welcome to Lost Inf. I'm here to help you relax tonight. I know many of you use this video to fall asleep. So, before you get too cozy, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'd love to hear from you. Story 1. The sledgehammer hit the brick wall for the third time that morning when Michael Torres heard something different. Not the solid thud of century-old masonry, but a hollow echo that suggested emptiness beyond. It was October 2019, and the construction crew had been hired to modernize the heating system in the basement of St. Augustine's Preparatory Choir School, a prestigious institution that had trained young vocalists since 1897. Torres stopped swinging. He called over his foreman, Danny Chen, who pressed his ear against the wall. The two men exchanged glances. This wall wasn't on any of the architectural plans they'd been given. In fact, according to the blueprints, there should have been another 6 feet of foundation beyond this point. They broke through carefully, dust and debris falling away to reveal a darkness that seemed to absorb their flashlight beams. The smell hit them immediately, not the sharp stench of recent decay, but something older, the smell of forgotten time and sealed spaces. When Chen climbed through the opening, his flashlight swept across a chamber approximately 30 feet long and 15 feet wide. The ceiling was vaulted, supported by Gothic arches that matched the architecture of the building above. But it was what lined the walls that made him stumble backward, nearly dropping his light. Wooden shelves, built directly into alcoves carved from the stone, and on those shelves, small forms wrapped in deteriorating canvas and burlap. Chen counted quickly, his breath coming faster. 17 bundles, each roughly the same size, each unmistakably the size of a child. The Vermont State Police arrived within 40 minutes. The FBI's evidence response team was on site by that evening. What they found in that sealed chamber would launch an investigation that would eventually span 3 states, involve over 200 interviews, and uncover one of the most methodical and disturbing cases of serial child murder in American history. The remains were carefully documented and removed over 3 days. Forensic anthropologists from the University of Vermont worked alongside federal investigators. The bodies had been preserved by the consistent, cool temperature and low humidity of the sealed chamber. Each child had been wrapped with almost ceremonial care, their hands folded across their chests. Each bundle included a small brass plaque, engraved with initials, a date, and a single word in Latin, perfectus. The dates ranged from 1962 to 1989, 27 years. The initials would eventually be matched to missing children, runaways, and students who had officially been recorded as having transferred to other schools or returned to troubled homes. But before investigators could identify the victims, they needed to understand who had created this hidden tomb and why. The answer began with Theodore Whitmore. Theodore James Whitmore was born in 1928 in Montpelier, Vermont, to a family of significant local standing. His father served as a state senator. His mother came from old money, her family having made their fortune in the granite quarries that defined much of Vermont's industrial history. Theodore showed musical aptitude early, mastering piano by age 7 and conducting his first church choir at 14. He attended Juilliard on scholarship, studying music theory and vocal performance. By all accounts, he was brilliant but demanding, expecting perfection from himself and others. Classmates from that era, tracked down by investigators, described him as intense, controlled, someone who seemed to view human interaction as another form of composition to be carefully orchestrated. After graduation in 1950, Whitmore spent a decade teaching at various private schools throughout New England. He married in 1955. His wife, Margaret, was the daughter of Vermont's Attorney General. The marriage produced no children, a fact that several of their acquaintances noted, though no one knew whether this was by choice or circumstance. Margaret would later describe her husband as emotionally distant, more married to his work than to her. They separated in 1968, but never divorced. She died in 2003, never knowing what her husband had done. In 1961, Whitmore was hired as headmaster of St. Augustine's Preparatory Choir School. The school had fallen on difficult times. Enrollment had dropped, and the facility needed significant repairs. Whitmore arrived with impressive credentials, glowing recommendations, and a 5-year plan to restore St. Augustine's to prominence. The board of directors, desperate to save the institution, gave him nearly complete autonomy. He delivered on his promises. Within 5 years, St. Augustine's had a waiting list. The choir performed at Carnegie Hall. Students went on to prestigious conservatories. Parents paid premium tuition for the privilege of having Theodore Whitmore shape their children's musical futures. The school became his kingdom, and he ruled it with absolute authority. But there was another side to Theodore Whitmore's educational philosophy. Former students, now in their 60s and 70s, spoke to investigators about the headmaster's obsession with perfection. He didn't just want good performances. He would make students repeat single notes for hours until the tone satisfied him. Those who failed to meet his standards faced harsh discipline, public humiliation, hours of isolated practice in soundproof rooms, restricted diets to maintain specific vocal qualities. Several former students described what Whitmore called correction sessions. Students who disappointed him would be taken to his office after hours. The sessions could last for hours. Students emerged, shaken, pale, sometimes bruised, but no one reported it. This was the 1960s and 70s. Private schools operated with minimal oversight. Whitmore was a respected educator, married to the daughter of law enforcement royalty. His word was trusted absolutely. The sealed chamber provided the physical evidence. Understanding Whitmore's psychology required deeper investigation. FBI behavioral analysts reviewed his personal papers, journals, and letters discovered in his residence. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had developed an elaborate philosophical justification for murder. Whitmore believed in something he called vocal transfiguration. His journals, written in precise, controlled handwriting, described a theory that certain rare children possessed what he called perfect instruments. These were voices of such purity that they transcended normal human capability. But this perfection was temporary, threatened by the changes of puberty, by the corruption of the world, by time itself. In Whitmore's twisted ideology, allowing these perfect voices to be destroyed by natural development was a greater sin than preserving them through death. He wrote extensively about ancient civilizations that had practiced child sacrifice, about the Catholic Church's historical use of castrati to preserve prepubescent vocal ranges, about the concept of eternal youth in art and music. He convinced himself that he was not a murderer but a preserver of perfection. The brass plaques made horrible sense. Perfectus, perfect, preserved at the moment of their greatest purity. Investigators worked to identify the remains. Dental records, old missing persons reports, School archives and DNA testing gradually gave names to the victims. Each case followed a similar pattern. The first victim, identified as Thomas Brennan, had been reported missing in October 1962. Thomas was 12 years old, a scholarship student from a working-class family. His mother, widowed and working 2 jobs, had been grateful when St. Augustine's accepted her son. Thomas had the voice of an angel, people said. He sang solos at every performance. Then, one November evening, Thomas didn't come home. The school reported that he'd been picked up by an uncle, but Thomas had no uncle. His mother filed a missing persons report. Police investigated briefly but found no evidence of foul play at the school. The headmaster was cooperative, concerned, respectable. The case went cold. This pattern repeated. Children from vulnerable backgrounds, single parents, foster families, working-class homes where parents couldn't afford to push back against institutional authority. Children with extraordinary voices. Children who had caught Theodore Whitmore's attention. Whitmore would select a child, cultivate them, praise their gift. He would arrange private lessons, special opportunities. He would build trust. Then, when the time came, when he determined that their voice had reached peak perfection and would soon be lost to puberty, he would act that the forensic evidence showed that most victims had been poisoned. Toxicology tests detected traces of barbiturates in bone marrow samples. Whitmore had access to medications through the school's medical office. The deaths would have been relatively peaceful, the children likely sedated before losing consciousness. This fit Whitmore's psychology. He saw himself not as a killer, but as a curator. There was no anger in these deaths, no violence. Just cold, calculated preservation. Asterisk after death. He would perform what his journals called the commendation ceremony. He would wrap the body, add the plaque, and place the child in the chamber he'd had constructed during the school's 1962 renovation. He'd convinced the board that the wall was necessary for structural support. In reality, it sealed his collection. The school continued operating normally above this hidden tomb. Concerts were performed. Students graduated. Theodore Whitmore received awards for educational excellence. In 1985, he was named Vermont Educator of the Year. In the photograph from that ceremony, he stands beside the governor, holding a crystal award, his expression serene and controlled. The last victim was identified as Rebecca Chen, unrelated to foreman Danny Chen, who found the chamber. Rebecca disappeared in March 1989. She was 11 years old, the daughter of immigrants who ran a restaurant in Burlington. Rebecca had a soprano voice that could, as one music teacher wrote, make you believe in heaven. Her parents were devastated when she vanished. The investigation led nowhere. Shortly after Rebecca's disappearance, Theodore Whitmore announced his retirement. He was 61, in good health, at the height of his professional reputation. He claimed he wanted to travel, to write about music education. The school threw him a farewell gala. Students past and present performed. The governor attended. Whitmore gave a speech about the importance of preserving beauty in an increasingly chaotic world. He moved to a small town in New Hampshire, where he lived quietly for the next 30 years. He composed music, wrote scholarly articles, and maintained correspondence with former colleagues. He never remarried. He lived alone in a modest house, was known as a quiet, cultured gentleman who kept to himself. When he died in 2018 at age 90, his obituary in the Burlington Free Press praised his contributions to music education. No one suspected the truth, but Theodore Whitmore had made one mistake. He'd built his hidden chamber to last, yes, but he hadn't anticipated that St. Augustine's would eventually need modernization. He couldn't have known that a heating system upgrade 30 years after his retirement would lead a construction worker to break through his carefully constructed wall as the investigation expanded. Disturbing questions emerged. How had Whitmore operated undetected for 27 years? The answer revealed systemic failures that haunted everyone involved. First, the victims had been carefully chosen. Children from families with limited resources, limited social capital, limited ability to demand answers. When these children disappeared, investigations were cursory. Missing persons reports were filed, but in an era before national databases and Amber Alerts, children simply vanished into the cracks of the system. Second, Whitmore's position and connections provided insulation. He was married to the daughter of the Attorney General. His father-in-law, Thomas Ashford, served in that position from 1956 to 1969, covering the crucial early years of Whitmore's crimes. While there's no evidence Ashford knew about the murders, his relationship to Whitmore may have caused local police to be less aggressive in their investigations of anything involving St. Augustine's III. The culture of private institutions in that era was one of minimal oversight and maximum deference to authority. Headmasters of prestigious schools were trusted implicitly. Parents of scholarship students, grateful for opportunities, were reluctant to complain or question. The few concerns that were raised about Whitmore's harsh disciplinary methods were dismissed as the price of excellence. The investigation uncovered one particularly haunting detail. In 1976, a janitor at St. Augustine's named Robert Pulaski had reported strange sounds coming from the basement. Scratching, he said, like something behind the walls. He'd mentioned it to several people, including filing a maintenance report. That report was found in the school's archives. Whitmore had responded personally, writing that the sounds were simply pipes expanding and contracting. No further investigation occurred. Pulaski died in 1998. As investigators dug deeper into Whitmore's history, they found suggestions of earlier crimes. During his decade of teaching before St. Augustine's, Whitmore had worked at 4 different private schools. At each institution, there had been at least one case of a student disappearing under mysterious circumstances. The schools were in Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. A task force was formed, bringing together investigators from multiple states. They began reviewing missing persons cases from schools where Whitmore had worked between 1950 and 1961. They identified 6 cases that fit the pattern: talented young students, vulnerable backgrounds, disappearances that were never fully investigated. In May 2021, investigators obtained a warrant to excavate the basement of Whitmore's New Hampshire home. Ground-penetrating radar had detected anomalies beneath the concrete floor of his workshop. Over a week-long dig, they found 3 more sets of remains. 2 were identified as students from schools where Whitmore taught in the 1950s. The third remained unidentified. The total known victim count stands at 20. Investigators believe there may be more. The community of Burlington struggled to process the revelation. St. Augustine's Preparatory Choir School, though not legally responsible for Whitmore's crimes, faced tremendous pressure. Many alumni reported needing therapy to process their memories of the headmaster. Some had been students during the years when children were being murdered beneath their feet. The school established a victims fund and brought in counselors. The facility itself became a crime scene, then a memorial. The chamber where the children were found has been preserved exactly as discovered, though it's now sealed behind glass. A memorial garden was planted on the school grounds, with 17 trees, one for each child found in the chamber. Small plaques bear their names and dates of birth. The word perfectus appears nowhere. Several of the victims' families filed. Civil suits. St. Augustine's settled quietly. The school struggled with enrollment and finally closed in 2023. The building has been sold to a developer who plans to convert it into apartments. There's debate about what should be done with the chamber. Some argue it should be filled in, the horror erased. Others believe it should be maintained as a reminder of what happened and what was allowed to happen. The FBI's investigation remains open. The task force continues to review cold cases from the 1950s through the 1990s, looking for other potential victims. They're examining records from all private schools in New England, looking for patterns. They're reviewing missing persons reports from children who matched Whitmore's victim profile in 2023. Investigators received a letter from a retired music teacher who had worked briefly at St. Augustine's in the 1970s, described Whitmore mentioning a colleague who shared his views on preserving perfection. She couldn't remember the name, but she remembered that this colleague had moved to a school in upstate New York. The task force is following this lead. Evidence continues to arrive. Former students, now elderly, are coming forward with memories they'd suppressed or dismissed. Maintenance records are being reviewed. Architecture firms that worked on private schools in that era are being contacted. The question that haunts everyone involved is simple. Was Theodore Whitmore unique? Or was he part of a broader network of educators who shared his twisted philosophy? His journals mention correspondence with like-minded colleagues, but no names. They reference others who understand the burden of preservation, but provide no details. In a locked evidence room in Burlington, boxes contain Theodore Whitmore's papers, his journals, his correspondence. Investigators continue to analyze every page, looking for clues. Each letter he wrote, each article he published, each person he mentioned is being traced. Because if Theodore Whitmore was able to kill for nearly 3 decades without detection, what does that say about the systems that were supposed to protect children? And if there were others who thought as he did, who shared his ideology, how many more children might be waiting to be found? The investigation continues. The task force grows. And somewhere in filing cabinets and archived records, more names may be waiting to be discovered. More families waiting for answers. More chambers waiting to be opened. Story 2. Sarah Mitchell had been an environmental compliance inspector for the Oklahoma Department of Environmental Quality for 11 years. She'd seen her share of violations, improper waste disposal, outdated equipment, but she'd never seen anything like what she found at Mercy Haven Adoption Services on a cold morning in January 2020. The facility had closed 6 months earlier after the state revoked its license due to financial irregularities. The building sat empty on the outskirts of Tulsa, a sprawling single-story structure that had once been a tuberculosis sanatorium before being converted into an adoption agency in 1978. Sarah's job that day was routine: inspect the old medical incinerator to ensure it had been properly decommissioned before the building could be sold. The incinerator was located in a separate brick structure behind the main building, connected by a covered walkway. It was a Waste-Tech Model 4000, manufactured in 1977, designed for medical waste disposal. according to records. It had been decommissioned in 2015 when the facility switched to a contracted waste removal service. Sarah opened the ash chamber, expecting to find it empty or containing only residual ash from its years of operation. Instead, she found it had been used recently. Very recently. The ash was still slightly warm to the touch, though the building had been without power for months. Someone had been burning something here, and not that long ago. She collected samples as protocol required, sealing them in evidence bags. Back at the laboratory, routine analysis revealed something that made the technician call his supervisor immediately. The ash contained calcium phosphate in patterns consistent with skeletal remains. Human skeletal remains. The Tulsa Police Department arrived at Mercy Haven the next morning with cadaver dogs and ground-penetrating radar. What they found would expose an operation that had been running for over 40 years, spanning multiple states and involving hundreds of victims. The incinerator itself became a crime scene. Forensic specialists carefully extracted and sifted through layers of ash. They found fragments of bone, some as small as a fingernail, others several inches long. The fragments were subjected to advanced DNA analysis. The bone density and development patterns indicated that most fragments came from infants and very young children. But it was what investigators found in the rest of the facility that told the full story. Mercy Haven's records had supposedly been transferred to the state when the agency closed, but someone had missed a storage room in the basement, hidden behind a false wall in what appeared to be a maintenance closet. Inside, investigators found filing cabinets containing decades of records that Mercy Haven's director had failed to turn over. These records documented a systematic operation that had been selling babies while reporting them as deceased. The director of Mercy Haven was Constance Fairholm, and understanding her story requires going back to the beginning. Constance Marie Fairholm was born in 1945 in Little Rock, Arkansas. Her father was a Baptist minister who ran a small church and an attached home for unwed mothers. Her mother worked as a nurse. Constance grew up surrounded by pregnant teenagers who'd been sent away by their families to give birth in secret and surrender their babies for adoption. She saw how the system worked. Girls arrived, ashamed and frightened. They gave birth. Their babies were taken. The girls returned home, and everyone pretended nothing had happened. The babies went to couples desperate for children. Couples willing to pay significant fees to ensure a smooth, quick adoption process. Constance attended nursing school. Graduating in 1966, she worked in obstetrics for several years before joining her father's ministry full-time in 1970. When he died in 1975, she inherited the home for unwed mothers. She was 30 years old, unmarried, and suddenly in control of a facility that processed 20 to 30 adoptions per year. In 1978, she married Raymond Fairholm, a real estate developer and Tulsa city councilman. Raymond had political ambitions and family money. The marriage gave Constance resources and connections. That same year, she moved her operation to Tulsa, purchasing the former sanatorium and rebranding as Mercy Haven Adoption Services. Raymond's position as city councilman, which he held from 1977 to 1989, provided Constance with political cover. His connections ensured that inspections were cursory and complaints were dismissed. When Raymond was elected to the Oklahoma State Senate in 1989, serving until 2001, Mercy Haven's operations expanded to cover multiple states. Raymond died in 2006, but by then, Constance's network was firmly established. Mercy Haven presented itself as a full-service adoption agency. They worked with birth mothers, provided prenatal care, facilitated placements, and handled all legal paperwork. They were licensed, inspected, and accredited. They had a board of directors that included prominent Tulsa citizens. They placed announcements in church bulletins and Christian publications, positioning themselves as a faith-based alternative to secular agencies. But the records found in that hidden basement room told a different story. Constance Fairholm had developed a system that generated enormous profits by exploiting every stage of the adoption process. It worked like this. Mercy Haven actively recruited pregnant women facing difficult circumstances. They advertised in states with restrictive abortion laws, targeting young women, poor women, women in crisis. They promised free medical care, housing, and support. They made the process sound compassionate and easy. Women would arrive at Mercy Haven during their second or third trimester. They'd live in dormitory-style rooms in the facility. They received prenatal care from staff doctors. They were isolated from their families, told this was necessary for their privacy and peace of mind. They were encouraged to surrender their parental rights before giving birth, told this would make everything simpler. The women gave birth at Mercy Haven. The facility had a small delivery ward, licensed and equipped. This was where Constance's system split into two tracks. Track 1 was legitimate. Healthy babies born to mothers who'd properly consented were placed with adoptive families through legal channels. Fees for these adoptions were high, typically $30,000 to $50,000, but the process was legal. These adoptions were documented, registered, and could withstand scrutiny. This track provided cover for the entire operation. Track 2 was where the crimes occurred. Some babies born at Mercy Haven were never placed through legal channels. Instead, they were sold to buyers willing to pay premium prices for a completely off-the-books adoption. These buyers included wealthy couples who didn't want to wait on adoption lists, international buyers seeking American babies, and, most disturbingly, people whose applications had been rejected by legitimate agencies due to disqualifying factors. The system required making babies available for Track 2, and Constance had developed methods to accomplish this. First, she targeted the most vulnerable birth mothers, women with substance abuse issues, mental health problems, or no family support. Women who were unlikely to follow up or have resources to investigate if something seemed wrong. Second, she lied to them. The records documented case after case where birth mothers were told their babies had died. Stillborn, they were told, or the baby died shortly after birth due to complications. The mothers, often sedated and emotionally devastated, were given death certificates. They were told the baby's body had been cremated according to state health regulations. They were given urns containing ash. The death certificates were forgeries. The supposed cremations never happened. The babies were alive, and they were being sold. The records found at Mercy Haven included ledgers documenting these transactions. Entries showed dates, codes that likely indicated buyers, and payments ranging from $75,000 to over $200,000 per infant. The codes were being analyzed by investigators, but the pattern was clear. Over 40 years, hundreds of babies had been reported as deceased when they'd actually been sold. Some birth mothers became suspicious. The records included correspondence from women who'd requested copies of medical records or asked questions about their babies' deaths. Constance's responses were carefully crafted. She expressed sympathy, She cited privacy laws and medical protocol. She suggested that dwelling on the tragedy wasn't healthy. Most women, grieving and unsupported, didn't push further. But what happened to babies who weren't sold? What happened to babies born with disabilities or medical issues that made them unsold? The incinerator suggested a horrifying answer: forensic analysis of the bone. Fragments recovered from the incinerator indicated that at least 37 infants had been burned there over the years. DNA analysis was complicated by the degraded state of the remains, but investigators were able to develop partial profiles. They began the painstaking process of trying to match these profiles to missing persons reports and to birth. Mothers who'd been told their babies died at mercy. Haven, the evidence suggested that Constance Fairholm had developed a purely economic calculus. Healthy babies were valuable and were sold. Babies with medical issues, disabilities, or complications were liabilities. They required expensive care, couldn't be sold, and their existence created paper trails and expenses. The records indicated these babies were killed, likely through lethal injection or suffocation, and then disposed of in the incinerator. This wasn't accidental death or medical tragedy. This was murder for profit. Dr. Michael Reeves, who served as Mercy Haven's medical director from 1985 to 2015, was arrested in March 2020. Initially, he claimed ignorance of any wrongdoing, but investigators found that he'd signed the forged death certificates. He'd administered sedatives to birth mothers. He'd personally delivered many of the babies that disappeared into Track 2. Under interrogation, Reeves broke. He described the operation in detail, confirming what the records suggested. He admitted that Constance Fairholm had recruited him specifically because his medical license had been suspended in Texas due to substance abuse issues. She'd offered him a second chance, a good salary, and asked very few questions about his methods. In exchange, she expected his cooperation. Reeves described the process of falsifying death certificates. Constance would tell him which babies needed to disappear. He'd create documentation showing stillbirth or neonatal death. He'd tell the mother her baby hadn't survived. Then he'd turn the living infant over to Constance, who handled the transfer to buyers. He also confirmed the murders of infants deemed unsolved. He claimed Constance made those decisions. He'd administer the lethal injection, usually a massive dose of morphine. The body would be placed in the incinerator, burned until nothing remained but ash and bone fragments. The birth mother would be told the same story: stillbirth or neonatal death. Cremation per protocol. Reeves provided details of specific cases. He remembered a set of twins born in 1998. One was healthy, one had Down syndrome. The healthy twin was sold to a buyer in California for $120,000. The twin with Down syndrome was killed that same night and incinerated the following morning. The mother, a 19-year-old from New Mexico, was told both twins had been stillborn. Constance Fairholm was arrested at her home in an upscale Tulsa neighborhood on March 15, 2020. She was 74 years old, a widow, a respected member of her church, and a philanthropist who donated to numerous charities. Her home was a sprawling ranch-style property filled with expensive art and antiques. In her study, investigators found additional records, including a private ledger documenting her personal profits from track to operations. Over 40 years, Constance Fairholm had made over $30 million from the illegal sale of infants. She refused to speak to investigators without her attorney present. That attorney, Harold Grayson, was one of Oklahoma's most prominent defense lawyers. The initial hearings focused on procedural issues while prosecutors built their case. But as the investigation expanded, it became clear that Mercy Haven wasn't an isolated operation. The records found in the facility included correspondence with individuals at other adoption agencies, maternity homes, and medical clinics across the South and Midwest. Constance had been part of a network. A multi-state task force was formed, including investigators from Oklahoma, Arkansas, Texas, Kansas, Missouri, and Louisiana. They began examining other facilities that had communicated with Mercy Haven. They reviewed adoption records, looking for patterns of reported infant deaths that might indicate similar operations. They found them in Shreveport, Louisiana. A maternity home called Grace Harbor had reported an unusually high infant mortality rate between 1980 and 2005. When investigators reviewed the records, they found the same patterns: vulnerable mothers, forged death certificates, babies disappearing from official documentation. In Kansas City, Missouri, an adoption facilitator named Margaret Stone had operated a service that connected birth mothers with adoptive families. Her records showed dozens of cases where babies had been reported as stillborn or died shortly after birth. Stone had died in 2015, but her former assistant agreed to cooperate with investigators. She confirmed that Stone had been selling babies off the books and had been in regular contact with Constance Fairholm. The network appeared to span at least 8 states. Investigators identified at least 6 other individuals who'd been involved in similar operations. Some had died, but 3 were still alive and were arrested. The birth mothers began coming forward. When news of the Mercy Haven investigation broke, hotlines were established for women who'd given birth at the facility. The calls flooded in. Hundreds of women who'd been told their babies died wanted to know if they'd been lied to. The process of matching mothers to babies was extraordinarily complex. Many of the track to adoptions had been completely undocumented. Babies had been given to buyers with false birth certificates showing the buyers as biological parents. These children, now adults, had no idea they'd been illegally adopted. Their entire identity was based on fraudulent documents. DNA testing became crucial. Birth mothers provided samples. Investigators began the process of trying to locate individuals who might have been babies sold through Mercy Haven. This meant tracking down people born between 1978 and 2019 whose birth certificates showed they were born in Oklahoma but whose families had no actual connection to the state. It meant reaching out to people who'd always felt disconnected from their supposed biological families. The first confirmed match came in August 2020. A woman named Jennifer Martinez, 32 years old and living in San Diego, saw news coverage of the Mercy Haven case. Something about it resonated with her. She'd always felt out of place in her family. Her parents, both deceased, had been older when she was born. They'd told her she was adopted, but the story had never quite made sense. She contacted the task force and provided a DNA sample. The results matched her to a birth mother named Lisa Chambers, who'd given birth at Mercy Haven in 1988 at age 17. Lisa had been told her daughter was stillborn. She'd spent 32 years grieving a child who was alive. The reunion was covered by national media. Lisa and Jennifer met at a hotel in Oklahoma City, surrounded by investigators and counselors. The photographs from that meeting show 2 women, decades apart in age, with identical eyes and nearly identical smiles. Lisa sobbed. Jennifer was stunned. processing the revelation that everything she'd been told about her origins was a lie. But the reunion also highlighted the complexity of these cases. Jennifer's adoptive parents, who'd paid $150,000 for an off-the-books adoption, had genuinely loved her. They'd raised her well. They'd never told her the adoption was illegal because they likely didn't fully understand that it was. They'd worked through a facilitator who'd presented the process as legitimate, if expensive. They'd believed they were giving a home to a child who needed one. Were they victims too, or were they complicit? The question haunted everyone involved. More matches followed. By early 2024, investigators had confirmed 43 cases where babies reported as dead had actually been sold and were still alive. The reunions were complex, emotional, and often painful. These were people who'd lived entire lives based on lies. They had families who'd raised them, identities they'd built, and now they were being told that their foundation was fraudulent. Some welcomed the truth. Others rejected it. Several people declined DNA testing, saying they didn't want to know. A few birth mothers, when contacted, said they preferred to maintain the belief that their babies had died rather than face the reality that they'd been sold. But what about the babies who weren't sold? The ones who'd been murdered and incinerated? Investigators identified 37 distinct DNA profiles from the bone fragments. Matching these profiles to specific birth mothers was proving difficult. Many of the women who'd given birth to babies with disabilities or medical issues had been even more vulnerable than average. Some were homeless. Some had been undocumented immigrants. Some had substance abuse issues that made their memories unreliable. The task force created a database of every woman known to have given birth at Mercy Haven between 1978 and 2019. They cross-referenced this with women who'd been told their babies died. They reached out to thousands of women, asking them to provide DNA samples. The process was slow and painful, but gradually matches were made. A woman in Arkansas learned that the son she'd been told died in 1991 had actually been killed because he was born with spina bifida. A woman in Texas learned that her twin daughters, reported as stillborn in 2003, had been killed because they were premature and their care would have been too expensive. Each confirmation was devastating. These weren't natural deaths or tragic medical outcomes. These were murders committed because babies didn't meet the criteria for profitability. Constance Fairholm remained silent throughout the investigation. Her attorney negotiated, looking for a deal that would spare her from the death penalty. Prosecutors considered it. They wanted information about the broader network, names of buyers, details of other facilities involved in similar operations. In November 2022, Constance agreed to cooperate in exchange for life in prison without parole rather than a death sentence. What she revealed expanded the investigation even further. She described a network of adoption facilitators, attorneys, doctors, and agency directors who'd been operating similar schemes across the South and Midwest since the 1970s. She named names. She provided details of meetings where methods were discussed. She described how they'd shared buyer lists and coordinated to avoid detection. She explained the economic logic that had driven the operation. Demand for healthy white infants far exceeded supply through legal channels. Adoptive couples would wait years for a placement. But there was a steady supply of pregnant women in crisis, women who could be exploited. The profit margins were enormous, and the risk was minimal because the victims were powerless. She talked about it like a business, using terms like inventory, product, and market demand. She showed no remorse. When prosecutors asked her about the murdered infants, she said simply that it had been necessary to manage costs and minimize risk. Dr. Michael Reeves was sentenced to 40 years in prison in 2021. He showed more emotion than Constance, crying during his sentencing hearing and apologizing to the families. But his cooperation had been crucial in building cases against other members of the network. The investigation spread. In 2023, a maternity home in Little Rock was raided after evidence suggested it had been part of Constance's network. Investigators found similar patterns: high rates of reported infant deaths, forged documents, and connections to facilitators who'd been selling babies. In Houston, an attorney who'd specialized in private adoptions was arrested after evidence showed he'd been falsifying birth certificates and facilitating illegal placements for decades. His files, once subpoenaed, revealed connections to Mercy Haven and other facilities in the network. The task force grew to include over 100 investigators from 15 states. They were reviewing records from dozens of facilities, interviewing hundreds of potential victims, and trying to map the full scope of the network. As of 2024, the investigation has identified over 200 babies who were illegally sold through Mercy Haven and associated facilities. 78 matches have been confirmed between birth mothers and children who are now adults. 63 cases of murdered infants have been documented, though investigators believe the true number is higher. Constance Fairholm is in federal prison, serving multiple life sentences. She's 78 years old now. The facility where she's housed reportedly keeps her in protective custody because other inmates have threatened her, but the investigation continues. The task force is still reviewing records, still reaching out to potential victims, still trying to identify buyers who'd participated in the illegal adoptions. They're working with international authorities because evidence suggests some babies were sold to buyers in other countries. New information arrives regularly. Former employees of various facilities come forward with information. People who'd been adopted under suspicious circumstances reach out for DNA testing. Attorneys who'd facilitated private adoptions decades ago provide records as part of immunity agreements. The scope of the network remains unclear. Constance's cooperation has been helpful, but investigators believe she's withholding information. They suspect there were other facilities involved that she hasn't disclosed. They're examining financial records, looking for unexplained transfers of money that might indicate additional members of the network. And there are questions about what happened to the buyers, the people who paid hundreds of thousands of dollars for illegal adoptions. Many are elderly now or have died. Some have been identified, but prosecutors face difficult decisions about whether to charge people who genuinely believed they were participating in legal, if expensive, adoptions. The focus has remained on the facilitators rather than the adoptive families, though that could change as the investigation progresses. Mercy Haven itself was demolished in 2023. Before demolition, the entire property was excavated. Investigators wanted to ensure there were no additional burial sites. None were found, suggesting the incinerator had been the primary means of disposal. A memorial now stands on the site. It's a simple stone marker bearing the names of the 63 murdered infants who've been identified. Space has been left for additional names as more victims are confirmed. The inscription reads, "These children deserved life. We failed them." The investigation continues. The task force meets monthly to review new leads and coordinate across jurisdictions. Evidence continues to accumulate, and somewhere in filing cabinets and storage units, more records may be waiting to reveal the full truth of how many children were stolen, sold, and murdered in the name of profit. Story 3. The hurricane that hit the Northern California coast in September 2021 was unprecedented for the region. Hurricane Olivia had weakened as it moved north, but still carried enough force to cause significant damage along the coastline. When the storm passed, it left behind flooding, power outages, and structural damage to dozens of buildings, including the historic Cape Sorrow Lighthouse. Cape Sorrow had been decommissioned in 1998 when automated navigation systems made the manned lighthouse obsolete. The structure, built in 1903, had been maintained as a historical site by the Mendocino Coastal Preservation Society, though budget constraints meant minimal upkeep. The hurricane's storm surge had undermined part of the foundation, and the Preservation Society hired a restoration company to assess the damage. David Kumar and his crew from Pacific Heritage Restoration arrived on October 12, 2021. The lighthouse stood on a rocky promontory, isolated and dramatic, exactly the kind of structure that drew tourists and photographers. Up close, the damage was more extensive than initial reports suggested. Water had infiltrated the lower levels, and cracks had appeared in the foundation. Kumar's team needed to access the basement to assess structural integrity. The basement door, they discovered, had been sealed with concrete at some point, probably during the 1998 decommissioning. Using jackhammers, they broke through. The smell that emerged stopped them immediately. It wasn't the smell of recent death. It was something older, more complex. Decay mixed with chemical preservatives, dampness, and something sweetly organic that none of them could identify. Kumar called the sheriff's office before entering, when investigators arrived with proper equipment and ventilation. They discovered a room that would be described in subsequent reports as a collection chamber. The basement was larger than expected, extending beyond the lighthouse's visible footprint. It had been excavated deeper into the rock, creating a space approximately 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. The walls were lined with glass-fronted cases, like museum displays. Each case contained a body, not skeletons, but preserved remains, the flesh mummified through a combination of the basement's naturally cool, dry conditions and what forensic analysis would later identify as formaldehyde and other embalming chemicals. 40-2 cases. 42 women, each positioned as if sleeping, hands folded, dressed in white gowns. Each case had a brass plate affixed to the glass, engraved with a name, a date, and a phrase in Latin: Purificata et conservata, purified and preserved. The Mendocino County Sheriff's Office immediately secured the scene and called in the FBI. The California Department of Justice sent a forensic team. What they found would expose crimes spanning nearly 3 decades and reveal that a trusted religious figure had been operating as a serial killer in one of the most isolated postings in the Coast Guard. Marcus Pendleton had been the last keeper of Cape Sorrow Lighthouse, serving from 1985 until its decommissioning in 1998. But understanding his crimes required understanding the unique circumstances of his position and the person he'd been. Marcus William Pendleton was born in 1952 in Portland, Oregon, to a family with deep roots in maritime service. His father had been a merchant marine, his grandfather a Navy officer. Maritime service was the family tradition, and Marcus never questioned that he'd follow it. He enlisted in the Coast Guard in 1970 at age 18. He served on various vessels and stations, earning a reputation as competent if unremarkable. In 1975, he married Elizabeth Cortland, the daughter of a Coast Guard admiral. The marriage provided connections and opportunities. By 1980, Marcus had been promoted to Chief Petty Officer, but it was his second role that gave him both access and cover. In 1982, Marcus completed training to become a Coast Guard chaplain, a dual-role position. He could serve as both operational Coast Guard personnel and as spiritual counsel to service members. This was particularly valuable in isolated postings where bringing in civilian clergy was impractical as a chaplain. Marcus presented himself as devoutly religious, deeply committed to serving those in spiritual crises. He held prayer services, counseled personnel dealing with stress or family problems, and performed marriages and funerals. His commanding officers rated him highly. His wife Elizabeth, serving as a Coast Guard spouse, hosted social functions and volunteered with military family support services. In 1985, Marcus requested assignment to Cape Sorrow Lighthouse. These isolated lighthouse postings were becoming rare as automation advanced, but a few remained operational. Cape Sorrow was particularly remote, accessible only by a rough coastal road that became impassable in winter. The nearest town, Mendocino, was 18 miles away. Most Coast Guard personnel avoided such isolated assignments, but Marcus volunteered. He told his superiors that the isolation would allow him to focus on his spiritual development and that he could better serve God in a place of solitude and reflection. His wife Elizabeth would accompany him, making the posting more suitable. The Coast Guard approved the assignment. Marcus and Elizabeth moved to the lighthouse keeper's cottage, adjacent to the tower. Their nearest neighbors were miles away. Supply runs happened every 2 weeks. In winter, they might go a month without seeing another person. It was perfect isolation for what Marcus had been, planning the forensic investigation of the collection. Chamber revealed that Marcus had begun excavating it almost immediately after arriving at Cape Sorrow. The natural cave system beneath the lighthouse provided a starting point. He'd spent months expanding it, removing rock, reinforcing walls with concrete, and creating the climate-controlled environment necessary for preservation. The glass cases had been custom-made. Investigators traced the orders to a medical supply company in San Francisco. Marcus had purchased them over several years, claiming they were for preserving Coast Guard historical artifacts. The brass plates had been engraved by a trophy shop in Eureka, where Marcus had brought them in small batches, telling the proprietor he was creating a memorial for deceased family members. The first victim entered the collection in March 1986. Her brass plate identified her as Sarah Dennison, aged 23. The date matched a missing persons report from Mendocino County. Sarah had been a drifter, traveling the coast. Last seen hitchhiking north of Mendocino in February 1986. The pattern that emerged from the brass plates and subsequent investigation was chilling in its consistency. Marcus had targeted women who were transient, vulnerable, unlikely to be intensely searched for. Hitchhikers, runaways, sex workers, women with substance abuse issues, women passing through the coastal communities, women who existed on the margins. He would encounter them during his trips to Mendocino for supplies. As a Coast Guard chaplain in uniform, he projected authority and trustworthiness. He would offer assistance, a meal, a place to stay. The lighthouse, he'd explain, had a guest room. He and his wife often hosted travelers who needed help. the women would accept. They'd drive with him to Cape Sorrow, and they'd never be seen again. Marcus's journals, discovered in a locked cabinet in the keeper's cottage, documented his ideology and methods in disturbing detail. He'd been influenced by extreme interpretations of religious texts about purity, sin, and redemption. He viewed women, particularly women he deemed as living sinful lives, as corrupted souls in need of purification. His twisted theology held that through ritual cleansing, prayer, and ultimately death, he could purify these women and preserve them in a state of spiritual grace. The murders weren't acts of violence in his mind, but acts of salvation. He was rescuing them from lives of sin and placing them in eternal repose. The journals described his selection criteria. He looked for women who showed signs of moral degradation in his view. Hitchhiking itself was evidence of improper behavior. Women with substance abuse issues were corrupted vessels. Sex workers were the most fallen and therefore most in need of his intervention. Once a woman arrived at the lighthouse, Marcus would follow a ritual process he'd developed. First, confession. As a chaplain, he'd encourage the woman to confess her sins. He'd probe for details of her life, her sexual history, her mistakes and regrets. The journals documented these confessions in detail, suggesting Marcus derived satisfaction from hearing them. Next came physical purification. The woman would be bathed, her hair washed and brushed, her body cleaned according to Marcus's exacting standards. He described this process in clinical, almost medical terms, as if he were preparing a patient for surgery. Then came the spiritual purification. Hours of prayer, Bible readings, hymns. Marcus would tell the woman she was being prepared for salvation, that her sins were being washed away. Many victims, vulnerable and confused, went along with this. Some tried to leave, but by then they were miles from help, isolated in a location few people even knew existed. The murder method was consistent. Forensic analysis of the preserved remains showed that victims had been poisoned with a combination of sedatives and toxins. Marcus would prepare a final meal, which he called the sacrament, laced with barbiturates and digitalis. The victims would fall unconscious, then die within hours. After death came preservation. Marcus had taught himself embalming techniques through correspondence courses and veterinary manuals. He would drain the body, inject preservative chemicals, and position the victim in the white gown he'd prepared. Once the initial preservation was complete, he'd seal the body in one of the glass cases, creating an oxygen-free environment that slowed further decay. Each woman joined his collection, as he called it. His journals described visiting the chamber regularly, praying over each case, maintaining the displays. He kept detailed records of each woman when she'd arrived, what she'd confessed when she'd been purified, and where she now resided in the collection. The journals also revealed his wife Elizabeth's role, and here the investigation encountered one of its most disturbing aspects. Elizabeth Pendleton had known, not from the beginning, but she'd discovered the chamber in 1988, just 2 years after the first murder. She'd found the entrance hidden behind a false wall in the basement storage area. She'd seen what her husband had created. Her diary, found in the couple's cottage, documented her response. Initially, she was horrified. She confronted Marcus, but Marcus, according to her diary, convinced her that his work was divinely inspired. He was saving lost souls. He was performing God's work in a fallen world. Elizabeth, raised in a strict religious household and trained in military obedience to authority, particularly male authority, was psychologically vulnerable to Marcus's manipulation. Her diary showed her mental evolution from horror to acceptance to complicity. By 1990, Elizabeth was actively helping. She'd go to Mendocino and identify potential victims. She'd reassure women that the lighthouse was safe, that she and her husband were good Christian people who helped travelers. Her presence as a woman made victims more comfortable, less suspicious. She'd help with the preparation process, the bathing and dressing. She'd participate in the prayer rituals. She'd assist with the embalming. Her diary described this as her duty as a wife and as a servant of God. The Pendletons continued their work at Cape Sorrow through the 1990s. They added to the collection steadily, usually 3 to 4 women per year. By 1998, when the lighthouse was decommissioned, 42 women had been murdered and preserved in the basement chamber. The decommissioning presented a problem. The Pendletons would have to leave. They'd lose access to their collection. Marcus's journals from this period showed increasing anxiety about leaving his purified souls behind. His solution was to seal the chamber. In the months before they departed Cape Sorrow, Marcus bricked up the entrance from the basement and poured concrete over it. He ensured the chamber was as airtight and climate-stable as possible. Then he and Elizabeth left, relocating to a Coast Guard retirement community in Florida. From 1998 to 2021, the collection remained hidden beneath the abandoned lighthouse. The Preservation Society maintained the site, but never had reason to access the sealed basement. Tours were limited to the tower itself and the keeper's cottage. Marcus retired from the Coast Guard in 1998 with full honors. He'd served 28 years, earned commendations, and was respected as a chaplain who'd served in difficult, isolated postings. He and Elizabeth settled into retirement in a small apartment in Pensacola, Florida. Marcus became active in their local church, volunteering with homeless outreach programs. Elizabeth joined church committees and hosted Bible study groups. They were known as a quiet, devout couple. Nobody suspected that they'd spent 13 years murdering women and preserving their bodies in a hidden chamber. When the chamber was discovered in 2021, investigators had to identify the victims and locate Marcus and Elizabeth. The brass plates provided names, but most proved to be false. Marcus had assigned new names to his victims during the purification process, erasing their actual identities and giving them what he considered pure, biblical names. Identifying the victims required extensive work. Forensic anthropologists examined the remains, documenting distinguishing features, dental work, old injuries, and tattoos. This information was cross-referenced with missing persons databases from California, Oregon, and Washington. DNA was extracted where possible and entered into national databases. Facial reconstruction was performed on several victims. Photographs and descriptions were circulated through media outlets, asking anyone with information to contact investigators. Gradually, identities emerged. The woman Marcus had named Sarah Dennison was actually Nicole Bradshaw, a 21-year-old who'd left Seattle in early 1986, planning to travel down the coast. Her family had reported her missing, but the trail had gone cold in Oregon. Another victim, labeled Mary Magdalene in Marcus's records, was identified as Crystal Martinez, a sex worker from San Francisco who'd disappeared in 1991. Her sister had never stopped looking for her. As identities were confirmed, investigators traveled to inform families. Many had spent decades wondering what happened to their daughters, sisters, mothers. The truth was horrifying, but at least it was truth. Several family members expressed grim relief at finally knowing. The FBI located Marcus and Elizabeth Pendleton in Pensacola on October 20th, 2021. Both were arrested without incident. Marcus was 79 years old, Elizabeth 73. Both were in declining health, but both were mentally competent to stand trial. During interrogation, Marcus was cooperative in a disturbing way. He freely admitted to the murders, describing his process and ideology. He showed no remorse. He insisted he'd saved those women, that they'd died purified and would enter heaven in a state of grace. He'd given them salvation they couldn't have achieved on their own. He provided details that helped identify additional victims. He corrected investigators when they got facts wrong about the timeline or methods. He spoke about his collection with pride, describing it as his life's work. Elizabeth was initially less cooperative, claiming she'd been coerced and controlled by Marcus. But her diary, once recovered from their Florida apartment, contradicted this. She'd been an active, willing participant. Under continued interrogation and faced with the evidence from her own writing, she eventually admitted her role. The Pendletons were charged with 42 counts of first-degree murder, along with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and abuse of a corpse. Due to their ages and health conditions, prosecutors decided not to pursue the death penalty, instead seeking life imprisonment without parole. Both pled guilty in 2022. The trial focused primarily on victim impact statements and evidence presentation. Family members of identified victims were given the opportunity to address the court. The proceedings lasted 3 weeks. Marcus showed no emotion throughout. When given the opportunity to speak before sentencing, he read a prepared statement that amounted to a religious sermon about purity and salvation. The judge cut him off, calling his ideology the deranged justification of a cruel and calculating murderer. Elizabeth wept during victim impact statements, but offered no apology that didn't include justification for her actions. She maintained that she'd believed she was doing God's work. Both received multiple life sentences. Marcus was sent to a federal medical facility due to his age and declining health. Elizabeth went to a federal women's prison. They have no contact with each other, but the investigation didn't end with their convictions. Questions remained about whether there were other victims. Other locations where Marcus might have committed similar crimes. Investigators reviewed Marcus's entire Coast Guard career, looking at every posting he'd held. Before Cape Sorrow, he'd served at stations in Alaska, Washington, and Northern California. At each location, they cross-referenced his presence with missing persons reports from the surrounding areas. They found correlations. During Marcus's posting in Alaska from 1976 to 1979, 6 women had disappeared from the region under circumstances similar to the Cape Sorrow victims. Transient women, hitchhikers, vulnerable individuals. The disappearances had never been connected because they occurred in different towns and weren't recognized as part of a pattern in Washington, where Marcus served from 1980 to 1985. Investigators found 4 more cases that matched the pattern. These women had vanished during times when Marcus was stationed nearby and had access to the areas where they were last seen. The question was whether Marcus had been killing before Cape Sorrow, and if so, what had happened to those earlier victims. His journals from Cape Sorrow made no mention of previous murders, beginning as if his work started in 1986, but investigators suspected he'd been evolving toward His crimes for years before Cape Sorrow gave him the perfect opportunity in 2023. Investigators obtained warrants to search properties where Marcus had lived during his earlier postings. At a former Coast Guard housing unit in Juneau, Alaska, now converted to civilian apartments, ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies in the crawlspace. Excavation revealed the remains of 3 women buried in shallow graves. The victims had been there for over 40 years. Identification was difficult due to the deteriorated state of the remains, but forensic analysis indicated they'd been murdered using methods similar to those Marcus employed at Cape Sorrow. Sedation followed by poisoning. This discovery suggested that Marcus had begun killing in the mid-1970s, a full decade before establishing his collection at Cape Sorrow. His early victims had been buried rather than preserved, suggesting his methodology evolved over time. Additional searches at Marcus's former residences in Washington are ongoing. Investigators believe there may be more burial sites yet to be discovered. The investigation also examined whether Marcus might have been part of a larger network. His journals mentioned corresponding with fellow seekers who understood his mission. These references were vague, never naming specific individuals, but they suggested Marcus had been in contact with others who shared his ideology. Investigators found letters in the Pendleton's Florida apartment, correspondence dating back to the 1980s. Some letters discussed religious concepts of purity and salvation in ways that echoed Marcus's ideology. The letters were signed with initials or pseudonyms, making identification difficult. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit is reviewing the correspondence, trying to identify the authors. They've developed profiles suggesting at least 3 other individuals who may have been committing similar crimes, possibly inspired by or coordinating with Marcus. A task force was established to investigate these potential connections. They're reviewing unsolved disappearances of women across the western United States, looking for patterns that might indicate copycat killings or coordinated activity. As of 2024, 46 victims of Marcus Pendleton have been confirmed, the 42 from Cape Sorrow and 4 from earlier postings. 38 victims have been identified. 8 remain unknown, their identities lost to time and Marcus's deliberate obscuring of their true names. Families continue to come forward with information. Anyone who had a female relative disappear in the Pacific Northwest between 1975 and 1998 has been asked to provide DNA samples for comparison against unidentified remains. The Cape Sorrow Lighthouse has been closed to the public. The Preservation Society debated whether to demolish the structure or maintain it as a memorial. They ultimately decided to preserve the lighthouse tower while removing the keeper's cottage and sealing the basement chamber permanently. A memorial was established on the grounds. A simple granite wall bearing the names of identified victims and markers for those still unknown. The inscription reads, "They were not purified. They were murdered. We remember them." Marcus Pendleton died in federal custody in March 2024 at age 72 of heart failure. He never expressed remorse. His final words, according to prison officials, were a prayer for the souls he'd saved. Elizabeth Pendleton remains in federal prison. She's reported to have mental health issues and remains in the prison's psychiatric unit. She has no visitors and no communication with the outside world, but the investigation continues. The task force meets quarterly to review new leads. Tips still come in from people who remember seeing Marcus during his various Coast Guard postings. Forensic teams continue examining locations where he lived or worked, and investigators continue analyzing his journals and correspondence, looking for clues about the fellow seekers he mentioned. Because if Marcus wasn't acting alone, if there were others who shared his twisted ideology and had similar opportunities and authority, there may be more hidden chambers waiting to be discovered, more victims waiting to be identified, more families waiting for answers about what happened to their missing daughters. The investigation remains open. Evidence continues to arrive, and somewhere in archived correspondence and coded language, the names of Marcus Pendleton's associates may be waiting to be decoded. Story 4. The winter of 2022 brought unprecedented rainfall to California's Central Valley. Rivers flooded, levees broke, and the ground, saturated beyond capacity, began to collapse. On January 18, 2022, a massive sinkhole opened in an industrial area on the outskirts of Bakersfield, swallowing part of a storage facility's parking lot. The property had once been the winter headquarters of Wonderland traveling shows, a medium-sized carnival that had toured the western states from the 1970s through the early 2000s. The carnival had gone bankrupt in 2004, and the property had been sold and converted to storage units. Most people in Bakersfield had forgotten that Wonderland had ever been there. When the sinkhole opened, it revealed more than just collapsing earth. Construction crews brought in to assess the damage discovered that the collapse had exposed an underground structure, a concrete-lined pit approximately 40 feet deep and 20 feet in diameter, and at the bottom of that pit, illuminated by work lights, lay a tangle of human remains. The Kern County Sheriff's Office secured the site immediately. What they found would take months to fully excavate and years to fully understand. The pit contained the skeletal remains of at least 63 individuals, ranging from children to adults. Spanning a period of nearly 30 years, the discovery launched an investigation that would expose how one man, using the mobility and anonymity of carnival life, had been able to murder dozens of people while maintaining a respected position in local government. Bernard Holloway, known to everyone as Bernie, had been a fixture in Bakersfield's civic life for decades. But understanding his crimes required going back to the beginning, to the world of traveling carnivals and the unique opportunities they provided for. Predators. Bernard James Holloway was born in 1948 in Fresno, California. His father ran a small carnival ride operation, setting up at county fairs and local festivals. Bernie grew up in that world, learning the mechanics of rides, the psychology of crowds, and the rhythms of constant travel. The carnival wasn't just his father's business. It was the family's entire life. By age 20, Bernie had taken over daily operations as his father's health declined. In 1970, after his father's death, Bernie inherited the small operation. He was ambitious. Over the next decade, he acquired additional rides, hired more staff, and expanded from a simple ride operator to a full carnival show, complete with games, food vendors, and sideshow attractions. He named it Wonderland Traveling Shows, and by 1980, it had become a regular presence at fairs and festivals across California, Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. The carnival would tour from March through October, then return to its winter quarters in Bakersfield for maintenance and storage. In 1975, Bernie married Linda Castillo, whose father was a Kern County supervisor. The marriage provided Bernie with political connections that would prove crucial. Linda worked as a teacher and was active in community organizations. She gave Bernie respectability, a stable home base, and connections to Bakersfield's establishment. In 1982, Bernie was appointed to fill a vacancy on the Bakersfield City Council. His campaign literature emphasized his business success, his employment of over 50 people, his contribution to community events. He was re-elected in 1986 and 1990. In 1994, he won a seat on the Kern County Board of Supervisors, a position he'd hold until 2006. Bernie Holloway was known as a pro-business conservative, someone who understood working people because he'd employed them his entire life. He sponsored Little League teams, donated carnival equipment to school fundraisers, and was a regular at Rotary Club meetings. His political career and his carnival business reinforced each other. He was Bernie, the carnival guy who made it big, the hometown success story. But the carnival also provided Bernie with something else: access to vulnerable people and the perfect cover for making them disappear. The forensic investigation of the pit was extraordinarily complex. The remains were commingled, making it difficult to determine which bones belonged to which individual. Years of decomposition, groundwater seep, and the weight of earth and debris had damaged and scattered the skeletal material. A team of forensic anthropologists from California State University, Fresno, worked alongside FBI specialists. They carefully excavated the pit in layers, documenting and photographing everything. The process took 4 months. What emerged was a timeline of murder spanning from approximately 1978 to 2003. The victims varied widely in age, from children as young as 8 to adults in their 60s. They included both males and females. Cause of death was difficult to determine due to the deteriorated state of the remains, but several skulls showed evidence of blunt force trauma. The victims were identified through a combination of dental records, DNA analysis, and missing persons reports. As names began to emerge, a pattern became clear. These were people who existed on the margins of society, people who traveled with or near the carnival circuit. The first identified victim was Tommy Vickers, a 15-year-old runaway from Reno, Nevada. Tommy had disappeared in August 1978. His mother had reported him missing, but the investigation had gone nowhere. Tommy had a history of running away, and police assumed he'd either returned or had left the state. His dental records, maintained because of orthodontic work done the year before he vanished, provided a match to remains found in the pit. Other identifications followed. Maria Gonzalez, a 23-year-old carnival worker who'd disappeared in 1983. James Crawford, a transient man who'd been seen near the carnival in Phoenix in 1989 and never heard from again. Sarah Nguyen, a 16-year-old runaway last seen in Albuquerque in 1995. The victims came from different states, different years, different circumstances, but they had commonalities. They were people who wouldn't be intensely searched for, people whose disappearances might be attributed to the transient lifestyle of carnival life or homelessness. Understanding Bernie's methodology required examining the carnival world itself. Wonderland traveling shows employed a core crew of about 30 people who traveled with the carnival full-time. These were ride operators, game booth workers, food vendors, and mechanics who lived out of RVs and trailers parked at whatever lot the carnival occupied. But the carnival also attracted transient workers, people who'd sign on for a week or a season, working for cash under the table. These workers were often people running from something: bad relationships, criminal records, addiction, or just bad luck. The carnival asked few questions. You showed up, you worked, you got paid in cash. No background checks, no paperwork, no identity verification required. The carnival also attracted runaways and homeless youth, drawn by the lights and activity. Some tried to sneak onto rides, others hung around hoping to be hired. Some just gravitated to the carnival as a place of energy and possibility in whatever town they found themselves. Stranded Bernie Halloway had access to all these people. As owner and operator, he controlled hiring. He determined who got paid and who didn't. He decided who stayed with the carnival and who was left behind in whatever town they'd just departed. Former workers, tracked down by investigators, described Bernie as charming but unpredictable. He could be generous, paying bonuses or helping workers with personal problems. But he could also be cruel, docking pay for minor infractions, publicly humiliating workers, or firing people without warning in towns far from their homes. Several former workers described Bernie's counseling sessions. If someone was having problems with drugs, alcohol, or interpersonal conflicts, Bernie would offer to talk it through. These sessions happened in his personal trailer, usually late at night after the carnival closed. People would go in to talk to Bernie. Usually they'd emerge and continue working, but sometimes they wouldn't emerge at all. Workers would ask what happened to so-and-so who'd been called to talk to Bernie. The answer was always the same. They'd decided to move on, or they'd gotten into trouble and had to leave, or they'd gone back home. In the transient world of carnival work, this seemed normal. People came and went constantly. What Bernie had actually done was murder them. Bernie's trailer at the winter grounds in Bakersfield was larger than the others. A customized unit that served as both his office and living space when he stayed at the lot during the off-season. In the back of the trailer, Bernie had constructed a false floor that concealed a trapdoor. The trapdoor opened directly above the pit. The pit itself had been constructed in the late 1970s, during renovations to the winter grounds. Bernie had hired a concrete contractor to install underground fuel storage tanks for the carnival's generators and vehicles. But Bernie had the contractor build something else as well, the pit, disguised in paperwork as a wastewater collection system. The pit's mouth was covered with a heavy metal grate and a removable concrete slab. Bernie's trailer was positioned directly over it. The trapdoor in his trailer aligned with the opening dot. When Bernie decided someone needed to disappear, he'd call them to his trailer for a counseling session. Once inside, he'd either poison them, subdue them with drugs, or simply attack them. Former workers described Bernie as physically imposing, over 6 feet tall and heavily built. Most victims wouldn't have been able to resist. Once the victim was dead or unconscious, Bernie would open the trapdoor and drop the body into the pit. Sometimes he'd weight the body with chains. Other times, he'd simply let it fall. The pit was 40 feet deep. Bodies that went in weren't coming back out. During the touring season, the trailer would be elsewhere, and the pit would remain sealed and hidden. During winter, when the carnival returned to Bakersfield, Bernie would have access to dispose of new victims. This system worked for 25 years. The pit accumulated bodies. Bernie continued his double life. Respected county supervisor by day, carnival owner and serial killer whenever the opportunity arose. But the carnival business was changing. By the late 1990s, insurance costs were rising, regulations were tightening, and competition from theme parks and video games was cutting into profits. Wonderland Traveling Shows was struggling financially in 2003. Bernie made the decision to close the carnival. He was 55 years old, had been a county supervisor for 9 years, and could afford to retire from the carnival business. He sold off the rides and equipment, laid off the workers, and closed down operations before shutting down the winter grounds. Bernie needed to deal with the pit. His solution was to fill it. He hired a concrete company to pump concrete into what he claimed was an old wastewater collection system that needed to be sealed for safety reasons. The company filled the pit with concrete, entombing the bodies at the bottom. Bernie then sold the property to a developer who converted it into storage units. The pit was sealed beneath several feet of concrete and 40 feet of earth. Bernie likely believed it would never be discovered. He continued his political career, serving on the board of supervisors until 2006, when term limits forced him out. He remained active in business, investing in real estate and serving on various boards. He and Linda remained married, though by all accounts, their relationship was distant. They had 2 adult children who both lived out of state. Bernie settled into comfortable retirement. He golfed, traveled, and maintained his reputation as a successful businessman and former public servant. When people asked about his carnival days, he'd tell colorful stories about life on the road. He'd laugh about the characters he'd known and the adventures he'd had. He never mentioned the pit. The 2022 sinkhole changed everything. When authorities identified the remains as human and realized the scale of what they'd found, they began investigating the property's history. They discovered it had been the winter headquarters of Wonderland traveling shows. They learned that Bernie Holloway had owned and operated that Carnival. Bernie was 74 years old when FBI agents arrived at his Bakersfield home on January 25, 2022. He was arrested without incident. His wife, Linda, present during the arrest, appeared genuinely shocked. She claimed she'd known nothing about any murders. The investigation into Linda's potential involvement was thorough. Detectives examined her finances, her movements, her communications. They found no evidence she'd participated in or known about Bernie's crimes. Linda filed for divorce immediately after Bernie's arrest and cooperated fully with investigators. Bernie initially refused to talk, invoking his right to an attorney. His lawyer, one of Bakersfield's most prominent defense attorneys, began negotiations with prosecutors. The evidence was overwhelming, but Bernie held information prosecutors wanted: the identities of victims who remained unidentified and details about exactly how many people he'd killed. In May 2022, Bernie agreed to cooperate in exchange for life in prison rather than the death penalty. What he told investigators filled in the gaps in their understanding. Bernie admitted to killing 68 people between 1978 and 2003. Not all had gone into the pit. 5 victims from early in his killing career had been disposed of in other ways, buried in desert locations, dumped in rivers, left in abandoned buildings in cities the carnival had passed through. He described his victim selection process with disturbing calm. He looked for people who wouldn't be missed: runaways, addicts, people with no family connections, people who'd already vanished from mainstream society. The carnival attracted such people naturally, so he never lacked opportunities. He described various murder methods: sometimes poison, usually rat poison mixed into food or drink; sometimes blunt force trauma, usually a pipe or tire iron to the back of the head; sometimes strangulation. The method varied based on opportunity and convenience. He said he felt no remorse. These were people, he claimed, who were already lost. They were burdens on society, people who contributed nothing. By removing them, he was doing a service. His justification was purely pragmatic. not ideological. He didn't have elaborate theories or religious delusions. He simply saw certain people as worthless and felt entitled to dispose of them. When asked about his political career and community standing, Bernie shrugged. That was a different life, he said. The public Bernie was successful and respectable. The private Bernie did what needed to be done. He saw no contradiction. The investigation expanded beyond just identifying victims in the pit. Detectives traveled to every location where Wonderland traveling shows had operated, reviewing missing persons reports from those areas during years the carnival had been present. They found correlations. In Reno in 1984, 3 homeless individuals had disappeared during the week Wonderland was in town. In Flagstaff in 1992, a teenage runaway had vanished the same weekend the carnival departed. In dozens of cities across 4 states, people had disappeared when Bernie's carnival was present. Not all could be definitively linked to Bernie. Missing persons cases are complex, and people disappear for many reasons. But the statistical correlation was significant. Investigators compiled a list of over 100 potential victims, whose disappearances matched Bernie's patterns. Bernie provided information on some, but refused to discuss others. He seemed to enjoy having knowledge that investigators wanted. He'd confirm some victims, but stay silent on others, using his information as leverage for better prison conditions or other considerations. The families of identified victims were contacted. Many had spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones. The answers were horrifying but provided closure. Tommy Vicker's mother, now in her 70s, had never stopped searching for her son. She'd hired private investigators, appeared on television appeals, and maintained a website about Tommy's disappearance for over 20 years. When investigators confirmed Tommy had been murdered by Bernie Holloway, she said she felt relief that the uncertainty was finally over. Even though the truth was worse than she'd imagined, other families had similar reactions. The not knowing had been torture. Knowing, even knowing something terrible, was somehow better. Bernie Holloway pled guilty to 63 counts of first-degree murder in October 2022. The additional 5 victims from early in his killing career hadn't been recovered, and prosecutors decided to focus on cases where they had physical evidence. The trial's sentencing phase included victim impact statements from dozens of family members. They described the people Bernie had killed, their dreams, their struggles, their humanity. They wanted the court to know that these weren't nameless transients or worthless people, as Bernie had characterized them. They were sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, people with value and potential. Bernie showed no emotion during the statements. When given the opportunity to address the court, he declined. His attorney read a brief statement expressing regret, but those who'd watched Bernie during the proceedings doubted his sincerity. He was sentenced to 63 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. At age 74, he would die in prison, but the investigation didn't end. Too many questions remained unanswered. First, there was the question of Bernie's political connections. His father-in-law, Thomas Castillo, had been a Kern County supervisor during much of Bernie's killing spree. There was no evidence Castillo knew about the murders, but investigators examined whether Bernie's political position had provided protection from scrutiny. They found instances where complaints about Bernie's carnival had been dismissed or downplayed. Workers who'd reported abusive conditions or suspicious disappearances to local authorities had been ignored. Was this because Bernie was politically connected, or simply because transient carnival workers weren't taken seriously by law enforcement in that era? The answer seemed to be both. Bernie's position provided credibility. When police received complaints about the carnival, they'd contact Bernie directly rather than investigating independently. Bernie would explain away any concerns, and his word as a county supervisor carried weight. The complaints would be dropped. Second, there was the question of whether Bernie had accomplices. Running a carnival required help. Moving bodies, disposing of evidence, maintaining the pit. Could Bernie have done all this alone? Investigators focused on Bernie's inner circle at the carnival. His assistant manager, Dale Preston, had worked for Wonderland from 1985 until it closed in 2003. Dale had access to Bernie's trailer and would have been present during times when victims disappeared. Was arrested in March 2022. Initially, he denied any involvement, but forensic evidence from the pit included items that could be traced to specific years and locations. Investigators showed Dale evidence that bodies had been disposed of during times when Bernie was away from the carnival on political business. Someone else had to have had access to the pit. Under interrogation, Dale admitted he'd known about some murders. He claimed Bernie had forced his cooperation through threats and blackmail. Bernie had evidence of crimes Dale had committed years earlier and used it to ensure loyalty. Dale described helping dispose of 3 bodies. He said Bernie had already killed them. Dale had simply helped move them to the pit. He claimed he'd been terrified of Bernie and saw no way out. Prosecutors offered Dale a deal: testimony against Bernie in exchange for a reduced sentence on accessory charges. Dale accepted. His testimony provided additional details about Bernie's operation, confirming much of what Bernie had admitted. Dale was sentenced to 20 years in prison. He's eligible for parole in 2032. Third, there was the question of whether there were other disposal sites. Bernie had admitted to 5 early victims who hadn't gone into the pit. Where were they? Bernie provided vague information about desert burials, but no specific locations. Searches were conducted in areas where the carnival had regularly traveled, particularly remote desert locations in Nevada, Arizona, and New Mexico. Ground-penetrating radar surveys were performed. Cadaver dogs searched potential sites. As of 2024, none of these early victims have been recovered. Bernie may have been lying about their locations, or enough time has passed that remains have degraded beyond detection, or the desert is simply too vast to search comprehensively. A task force was formed to investigate unsolved missing persons cases from carnival circuits throughout the western United States. They're not just looking at Wonderland traveling shows, but at the broader carnival industry, asking whether Bernie was unique or whether the carnival world harbored other predators who recognized the same opportunities Bernie had exploited. The investigation revealed troubling patterns. Dozens of other carnivals had similar reports of workers disappearing, of complaints being ignored, of vulnerable people vanishing around carnival events. Some of these might be coincidental, but investigators believe some indicate other predators operating in similar ways. Interviews with former carnival workers across the industry revealed a culture where violence and exploitation were common, and where vulnerable people were seen as disposable. Multiple workers described seeing people beaten, robbed, or abandoned in unfamiliar cities. Some described witnessing what they believed were murders, but had been too frightened to report the carnival. Industry's transient nature and lack of regulation had created an environment where criminals could operate with impunity. The task force is working with state legislators to implement better oversight, background checks for carnival workers, and protocols for investigating disappearances connected to traveling shows. As of 2024, 63 victims from the pit have been identified. 37 remain unidentified, though DNA profiles have been developed for all of them. The profiles are in national databases, awaiting potential matches. Families continue to come forward. Anyone who had a relative disappear in the western states between 1978 and 2003, particularly if that person had any connection to carnival life or was living a transient lifestyle, has been asked to provide DNA samples for comparison. Bernie Holloway remains in federal prison. He's in declining health, suffering from diabetes and heart disease. Prison officials report he spends most of his time reading and writing letters, though he has few correspondents. His ex-wife Linda has no contact with him. His children have publicly disowned him. The property where the pit was discovered remains sealed. The storage facility has been permanently closed. The Kern County government is negotiating to purchase the property and convert it into a memorial park dedicated to victims of violence. The investigation continues. The task force meets monthly to review new leads and coordinate with law enforcement across multiple states. Cold cases are being re-examined with Bernie's patterns in mind. Carnival routes are being mapped against unsolved disappearances, and investigators continue analyzing Bernie's financial records, looking for unexplained payments or transactions that might indicate he wasn't working alone. Because while Bernie admitted to 68 murders, some investigators believe the true number could be higher. Gaps in his timeline, unexplained absences, and suspicious patterns suggest there may be more victims, more disposal sites, more secrets Bernie took with him to prison. The carnival world has changed since Bernie's era. Regulations are tighter, oversight is stronger, and the era of cash-paid, undocumented transient labor has largely ended. But the investigation into Bernie Holloway has revealed how long a predator could operate when systems failed to protect the most vulnerable. Evidence continues to arrive. Former carnival workers continue coming forward with information. And somewhere in the vast deserts of the Southwest, Bernie's earliest victims may still be waiting to be found. Story 5. The Reformation Sanitarium had stood on a remote hilltop outside Meridian, Mississippi for over a century. Built in 1912 as a private psychiatric facility for wealthy families who wanted their troubled relatives treated discreetly. It had operated continuously until its closure in 2015, due to bankruptcy and scandal involving Medicare fraud. The building sat abandoned for 8 years, slowly deteriorating. Local teenagers told stories about it being haunted. Urban explorers posted photographs of its decaying corridors online. In 2023, a development company purchased the property, planning to demolish the sanitarium and build a retirement community. On the scenic hilltop location, demolition was scheduled to begin on March 15, 2023. Crew from Jackson Demolition Services arrived to assess the structure and identify any hazardous materials that needed special handling before the building could be torn down. The crew chief, Marcus Webb, had been doing this work for 20 years. He'd demolished hospitals, schools, factories, and countless other structures. He thought he'd seen everything. He was wrong. The sanitarium's basement was extensive, housing what had once been laundry facilities, storage rooms, and mechanical systems. Webb's crew was documenting these spaces when one of his workers, Tommy Chen, noticed something odd about the floor plan. According to the architectural drawings, the basement should have been larger. There appeared to be a section that wasn't accessible from any of the existing rooms. Using ground-penetrating radar, they confirmed there was indeed another space beneath the basement. A sub-basement that didn't appear on any official plans. They found the entrance hidden behind a brick wall in what had been the boiler room. The bricks were painted to match the surrounding walls, making the sealed doorway nearly invisible. They broke through carefully. The smell that emerged was familiar to anyone who'd worked around death. The sweet, musty odor of human decomposition, old but unmistakable. Webb called the Lauderdale County Sheriff's Office. Immediately, what investigators found in that sub-basement would expose one of the most systematic and ideological mass murder operations in modern American history. The space was large, approximately 100 feet long and 50 feet wide, divided into several rooms. One room contained filing cabinets filled with meticulously maintained medical records. Another contained what appeared to be an operating theater, complete with surgical tables and equipment. The third room contained the bodies. They weren't skeletal remains. They were preserved, mummified through a combination of the sub-basement's climate-controlled environment and deliberate embalming. 89 bodies, each in a separate alcove carved into the walls, each wrapped in white linen, each tagged with a number and date. The medical records explained everything. They documented a program called the Reformation Initiative, operating from 1965 to 2014, aimed at what the records described as genetic purification through merciful elimination of defective specimens. The architect of this program was Dr. Evelyn Whitmore, and her story began long before Reformation Sanitarium. Evelyn Margaret Whitmore was born in 1935 in Jackson, Mississippi, to a prominent family. Her father, Judge Harrison Whitmore, served on the Mississippi Supreme Court. Her mother came from plantation aristocracy, old money rooted in cotton and, generations back, slavery. Evelyn grew up with every advantage: private schools, debutante balls, and expectations that she'd marry well and maintain her social position. But Evelyn had other ambitions. She was brilliant, graduating at the top of her class from Vanderbilt University in 1956 with a degree in biology. She attended medical school at Tulane, one of very few women in her class. She specialized in psychiatry and neurology, completing her residency in 1963. During her medical training, Evelyn became fascinated with eugenics, the pseudo-scientific movement aimed at improving human genetic quality through selective breeding and sterilization. Though eugenics had been discredited after its association with Nazi atrocities, some academics and medical professionals in the American South continued to advocate for it, particularly as it related to race and mental fitness. Evelyn's journals, discovered in the sub-basement, revealed her evolving ideology. She believed that mental illness, developmental disabilities, and what she termed moral deficiency were genetic diseases that threatened human progress. She viewed people with these conditions not as individuals deserving treatment and dignity, but as biological errors that needed to be corrected. She was particularly influenced by her father's views. Judge Whitmore was a staunch segregationist who believed in inherent racial hierarchies. He'd ruled on numerous cases involving forced sterilization of black women, always siding with the state's interest in protecting the gene pool. Evelyn absorbed these views and expanded them into a comprehensive philosophy of genetic purity. In 1964, Evelyn married Richard Thornton, a successful businessman whose family owned a chain of hospitals across the South. More importantly, Richard's uncle, Senator James Thornton, sat on the Senate Appropriations Committee and had significant influence over federal healthcare funding. The marriage provided Evelyn with resources, political connections, and access to institutional power. In 1965, using Thornton family money and leveraging Senator Thornton's connections, Evelyn was appointed medical director of Reformation Sanitarium. The facility had been struggling financially, and the board was desperate for someone with Evelyn's credentials and resources. They gave her broad authority to restructure the institution as she saw fit. Evelyn immediately implemented what she called modern scientific management of the facility. She brought in doctors who shared her views on eugenics and genetic purity. She reorganized patient care around her ideology, and she began the Reformation Initiative. The program worked like this. Reformation Sanitarium served two types of patients. First, wealthy individuals seeking private psychiatric care, drug rehabilitation, or rest cures. These patients paid premium rates and received excellent treatment in comfortable accommodations. They provided the revenue that kept the sanitarium financially viable and maintained its reputation as a quality facility. Second, the sanitarium accepted state-referred patients through Mississippi's mental health system. These were people committed by courts or family members, people diagnosed with severe mental illness, developmental disabilities, or behavioral problems. The state paid modest per-patient fees, but accepting these patients gave Evelyn access to a population she viewed as targets for her. Program.Evelyn evaluated every stat-referred patient using criteria she'd developed based on eugenic principles. She assessed their mental capacity, their family history, their racial background, and what she called their contribution potential. If she determined a patient was genetically defective and socially burdensome, they were marked for the initiative. The process was methodical and concealed within normal sanitarium operations. Patients selected for the initiative were moved to a secure ward, isolated from other patients and visitors. They were told they required specialized treatment. Over weeks or months, their medication would be adjusted in ways that deteriorated their condition. They'd be declared terminally ill, or their mental state would be documented as irreversibly declining. Then they'd be taken to the sub-basement operating theater. There, Evelyn or one of her trusted doctors would administer a lethal injection, usually potassium chloride, to induce cardiac arrest. The death certificate would attribute the death to natural causes related to their underlying condition, heart failure, seizure complications, or organ failure due to their psychiatric medications. The bodies were embalmed and placed in the sub-basement alcoves. Evelyn viewed this as creating a record of her work, evidence of the cleansing she was performing. Each body was tagged with a number corresponding to their file in her records, which documented their genetic defects and why their elimination was justified. Families were told their relatives had died from natural causes. If they requested the body, they received it after Evelyn had removed the body from the sub-basement and subjected it to a second, conventional embalming to conceal the evidence. Most families, dealing with the stigma of mental illness and often located in distant states, simply authorize cremation or burial in the sanitarium's small cemetery, without viewing the body. The medical records found in the sub-basement documented 89 murders between 1965 and 2014. The victims ranged in age from 14 to 73. They included people with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, intellectual disabilities, autism, and what Evelyn classified as moral insanity, which appeared to mean homosexuality, promiscuity, or rebellion against social norms. The records revealed patterns in Evelyn's victim selection that exposed the racist foundation of her ideology. Approximately 70% of the victims were black. Evelyn's notes described black patients using racial slurs and explicitly stated that their elimination was particularly important for preserving genetic quality. She targeted other groups as well. Poor whites from rural areas, whom she described as genetically inferior stock. People with any developmental disability, regardless of severity, and young women she classified as sexually promiscuous or morally deficient. One particularly horrifying case involved sisters Rachel and Rebecca Morrison, ages 17 and 16, admitted in 1978 because their father believed they were incorrigible. The girls had been caught with boys, wore makeup their father disapproved of, and listened to rock music. Their father, a Baptist minister, wanted them reformed. Evelyn's notes described the girls as genetically predisposed to moral degeneracy, and noted that sterilization would be insufficient. Elimination is required to prevent reproduction and social contamination. Both girls were murdered within 3 months of admission. Their father was told they'd died from complications of seizures they'd never actually had. He held a funeral, believing his daughters had been taken by God. The medical records showed that Evelyn hadn't worked alone. She'd recruited 4 other doctors to assist with the Reformation Initiative over the years. She'd trained nurses to administer the fatal injections. She'd employed orderlies to transport patients to the sub-basement and handle the bodies. How had so many people participated in mass murder for decades without anyone reporting it? The answer lay in Evelyn's careful recruitment and the culture she created. She selected staff who shared her ideological views or who were vulnerable to coercion. Dr. James Kirkland, who worked at Reformation from 1970 to 1995, had lost his medical license in Texas due to substance abuse. Evelyn offered him a second chance in exchange for loyalty and silence. Nurse Patricia Eldridge, employed from 1982 to 2008, was deep in gambling debt when Evelyn hired her and paid off her loans. Creating obligation and leverage, Evelyn also created a culture of absolute authority. She made it clear that questioning her judgment was insubordination. Staff who expressed concerns were fired immediately. The few who threatened to report what they'd witnessed were reminded of their own complicity and threatened with prosecution. Most powerfully, Evelyn provided ideological justification. She held regular staff meetings where she'd present her eugenic theories, framed the killings as mercy and social necessity, and convinced staff they were doing important, if difficult, work. She compared them to surgeons removing cancerous tumors. The patients weren't people. They were genetic defects being excised for the greater good. This combination of coercion, ideology, and self-interest kept staff compliant for decades. Those who left the sanitarium took their secrets with them, either believing in Evelyn's mission or, too, afraid of their own criminal liability to speak up. Evelyn's political connections provided additional protection. Her husband's uncle, Senator Thornton, served in the Senate until his death in 2002. His influence ensured that Reformation Sanitarium received favorable treatment from state regulators. Inspections were perfunctory. Complaints from families about their relatives' deaths were investigated minimally or not at all. In 1989, a social worker named Angela Peters reported concerns to the Mississippi Department of Mental Health about the unusual number of deaths at Reformation. She'd noticed that patients often died within months of admission, far higher than the state average for similar facilities. Her report was forwarded to the department's investigation unit. The investigation consisted of a single visit by an inspector who reviewed records Evelyn provided and interviewed staff members Evelyn selected. The inspector found no evidence of wrongdoing. Angela Peters' concerns were dismissed. She was later told by her supervisor to stop making accusations against Dr. Thornton, as Evelyn was known after her marriage. Peters resigned in frustration. Evelyn continued her work uninterrupted. The sub-basement filled steadily with bodies. Her records grew more detailed, documenting not just the victims but her theories about genetic improvement and her vision for expanding the program, because Evelyn didn't see the Reformation Initiative as limited to her sanitarium. Her journals discussed plans for a network of facilities across the South, all implementing similar programs. She corresponded with like-minded physicians at other institutions, discussing methodology and ideology. She envisioned a coordinated effort to purify the regional gene pool. Some of this correspondence was found in the sub-basement files. Letters from doctors at facilities in Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana, discussing their own efforts to eliminate defective patients. The letters were coded, avoiding explicit admission of murder, but the meaning was clear to anyone who understood the context. The FBI investigation would later identify at least 7 physicians at other institutions who'd been part of Evelyn's network. Most were deceased by 2023, but investigators began examining those facilities for evidence of similar crimes. Evelyn's husband, Richard, died in 2004. Senator Thornton had died 2 years earlier. Without these political shields, Evelyn became more vulnerable. In 2013, a new state administration began scrutinizing healthcare facilities more aggressively. Reformation Sanitarium was audited and found to have engaged in Medicare fraud, billing for services never provided. The facilities board forced Evelyn to retire in 2014. She was 79 years old and had been medical director for 49 years. The sanitarium limped along for another year, before filing for bankruptcy and closing in 2015. Evelyn retired to a large home in Jackson, maintained her medical license though she no longer practiced, and was active in social clubs and her church. She was known as a pioneering female physician, someone who'd broken barriers in a male-dominated field. She received lifetime achievement awards from medical associations when demolition workers discovered the sub-basement in March 2023. Investigators immediately identified Evelyn as the primary suspect. FBI agents and Mississippi State Police arrived at her Jackson home on March 18th. She was 87 years old, living alone in a house filled with antiques and medical journals. She was arrested without incident. When agents informed her of the charges, she reportedly smiled and said, "You found my life's work." Evelyn Whitmore was not insane in any legal sense. Psychological evaluations confirmed she was mentally competent, understood right from wrong, and had deliberately chosen her actions. She was a true believer in her ideology, someone who genuinely believed she'd been performing a service. During interrogation, she was cooperative and proud. She explained her theories, described her methodology, and justified her actions using arguments drawn from eugenic pseudoscience and her twisted interpretation of medical ethics. She showed no remorse. She believed she'd been right. She confirmed the 89 murders, documented in her records, and provided additional information about early victims whose bodies had been removed from the sub-basement and cremated before the alcoves were built. She estimated her total victim count at over 100. though she couldn't recall exact numbers from the earliest years. She also provided names of colleagues who'd assisted her over the decades. Some were dead, but several were still alive. Arrests followed across multiple states. Dr. James Kirkland, now 82 and living in Florida, was arrested in April 2023. Admitted to participating in at least 15 murders between 1970 and 1995, he claimed he'd been coerced by fear of exposure regarding his past license suspension, but evidence suggested he'd been an ideological collaborator who shared Evelyn's views. Nurse Patricia Eldridge, 74 and living in Alabama, was arrested in May 2023. She broke down during interrogation, claiming she'd been horrified by what she'd witnessed but felt trapped. Her cooperation provided crucial, corroborating details about the program's operation. 3 orderlies who'd worked at Reformation during various periods were also arrested. All eventually pled guilty to accessory charges in exchange for testimony against Evelyn and the doctors. The investigation expanded to examine the other facilities mentioned in Evelyn's correspondence. Federal and state investigators coordinated searches of 3 former psychiatric hospitals in Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana, at Pinewood Hospital in Montgomery, Alabama. Investigators found a similar concealed room containing preserved remains of 32 patients. The facility's former medical director, Dr. Harold Vincent, had died in 2018, but his records documented a program explicitly modeled on Evelyn's initiative at Riverside Psychiatric Center in Augusta, Georgia. No hidden rooms were found, but a review of death certificates revealed suspicious patterns. Between 1975 and 2005, the facility had reported death rates 3 times higher than comparable institutions. Many deaths were attributed to sudden cardiac arrest in young, otherwise healthy patients. Investigators exhumed several bodies and found evidence of lethal injection. The investigation uncovered what appeared to be a network of at least 11 facilities across the South, where physicians had implemented eugenic murder programs. The network had been loosely coordinated through correspondence and occasional meetings, but each facility operated independently. Combined, investigators estimated these facilities had murdered at least 300 patients between 1965 and 2014. Identifying victims was a massive undertaking. The records from Reformation provided names, but many families needed to be located decades after their relatives' deaths. Some families had moved, some had died, and some simply couldn't be found. DNA analysis was performed on all 89 bodies from the Reformation sub-basement. The DNA profiles were compared against samples from potential family members who came forward after news of the discovery broke. The process of contacting families was extraordinarily painful. Investigators had to tell people that their relatives, who they believed had died from natural causes decades ago, had actually been murdered as part of a eugenics program. Many families were devastated not just by the murder itself, but by the ideology behind it. The Morrison family learned that Rachel and Rebecca, the sisters admitted for being incorrigible, had been murdered in 1978. Their father, the Baptist minister who'd committed them, had died in 1995, never knowing the truth. Rachel and Rebecca's younger brother, now in his 60s, spoke to media about his sisters. They were just teenage girls, he said. They liked boys and music. That's all. My father was strict and thought they needed discipline. He sent them to Reformation, believing they'd be helped. Instead, they were murdered because some doctor thought they were genetically defective. They were my sisters. They weren't defective. They were children. Other families had similar stories. Children with autism, intellectual disabilities, or mental illness committed by parents who believed they were getting treatment. Instead, they'd been murdered because they didn't meet Evelyn Whitmore's standards for genetic fitness. The racial dimension of the crimes couldn't be ignored. The fact that 70% of Reformation's victims were black, and similar patterns existed at other facilities in the network, demonstrated that these programs were rooted in white supremacy and racist eugenics theory. Civil rights organizations called for comprehensive investigation into historical abuse of black patients in mental health institutions across the South. The Mississippi chapter of the NAACP filed a lawsuit seeking damages for families of victims and demanding a full accounting of similar programs that might have existed at other facilities. Evelyn Whitmore was charged with 89 counts of first-degree murder, along with conspiracy, kidnapping, and abuse of a corpse. Her trial began in January 2024 in federal court in Jackson. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: the bodies, the medical records, Evelyn's own admissions, and testimony from accomplices who'd cooperated. The defense didn't dispute the facts, but argued for life imprisonment rather than the death penalty, citing Evelyn's age and claiming her actions were the product of a different era's medical thinking. The prosecution rejected this argument. Eugenics had been discredited by the 1960s, they pointed out. Evelyn had known she was committing murder. That's why she'd hidden the bodies and falsified death certificates. She'd acted with full knowledge that her actions were criminal and immoral. The trial lasted 7 weeks. Victim impact statements from 43 family members took 2 full days. Many spoke about the loved ones they'd lost and the decades of lies they'd lived with. Some spoke about the broader implications, about how racism and ableism had enabled these murders. Evelyn showed no emotion throughout. When given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing, she gave what amounted to a lecture on eugenic theory, arguing that history would vindicate her. The judge cut her off, calling her views morally bankrupt pseudoscience that served as a thin justification for mass murder motivated by racism and contempt for human dignity. Evelyn Whitmore was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 89 consecutive life terms without possibility of parole. At 88 years old, she would die in prison. Dr. James Kirkland received 40 years. Nurse Patricia Eldridge, due to her cooperation and demonstrated remorse, received 15 years. The 3 orderlies received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years. But the investigation continued. The task force examining the broader network of facilities faced enormous challenges. Many records had been destroyed. Key figures had died. Decades had passed, making evidence collection difficult, yet they persisted. By late 2024, they'd identified over 200 additional victims across the network of facilities. Criminal charges were filed against 3 living physicians who'd participated in similar programs. Civil suits were filed on behalf of victims' families. The investigation also prompted broader examination of historical abuses in American psychiatric institutions. Researchers began reviewing death records from hundreds of facilities, looking for suspicious patterns. What they found suggested that eugenic murder programs, while not universal, had been more common than previously understood. State governments began issuing formal apologies to families of victims. Mississippi Governor Trent Michaels issued a public apology in June 2024, acknowledging the state's failure to protect vulnerable citizens and promising reforms to prevent similar abuses. The site of Reformation Sanitarium was never developed. The property was instead converted into a memorial. The sanitarium building was demolished, but the sub-basement was preserved and converted into a museum documenting the crimes and honoring the victims. The memorial, which opened in October 2024, includes the names of all 89 confirmed victims from Reformation, along with spaces for victims from other facilities as they're identified. The exhibit doesn't shy away from the racist foundations of the eugenics movement or the specific targeting of black patients, developmentally disabled people, and others deemed unfit. Educational programs at the memorial focus on the history of eugenics, the ongoing fight for disability rights, and the importance of vigilance against dehumanizing ideologies in medicine and society. As of early 2025, the investigation remains active. A federal task force continues examining facilities across the South, identifying victims, and pursuing any remaining living perpetrators. They're also working with historians to document the full scope of eugenic violence in American institutions. New information continues to emerge. In November 2024, a former nurse from a facility in Louisiana came forward with information about a program that operated there in the 1980s. Her testimony led to the identification of 16 additional victims. Families continue to come forward, requesting DNA testing to determine if their relatives might have been victims. The process is slow but ongoing, with new matches made every few months. Evelyn Whitmore remains in federal prison. She's in declining health, but remains mentally sharp. Prison officials report she spends her time writing a memoir defending her actions. No publisher has agreed to produce it. Her correspondence from prison, monitored by authorities, reveals she remains unrepentant. She continues to argue that her program was scientifically sound and morally justified. She claims that future generations will recognize her vision once sentimental attachment to the weak is overcome by rational eugenics. The investigation into her network continues. Investigators believe there may be other facilities involved that haven't yet been identified. They're analyzing decades of medical records, death certificates, and institutional archives, looking for patterns that might indicate similar programs, because the question that haunts everyone involved isn't just what Evelyn Whitmore did, but how many others like her operated undetected. How many other hidden rooms might exist? How many other victims are waiting to be found? The task force remains active. Evidence continues to arrive. And somewhere in filing cabinets and storage rooms across the South, more records may be waiting to reveal the full truth of how many people were murdered in the name of genetic purity, and how many perpetrators operated with institutional authority and political protection. The victims of Reformation Sanitarium and its network of associated facilities were killed because they were deemed genetically inferior, socially burdensome, or racially unacceptable. They were murdered by physicians who'd taken oaths to do no harm but who'd subordinated medical ethics to genocidal ideology. Their names are now known. Their stories are being told. And the investigation continues, ensuring that every victim is identified, every perpetrator held accountable, and the truth of what happened is never forgotten. Thank you for tuning in to Lost in Fear tonight. If these stories have affected you, please remember that resources are available for anyone dealing with trauma or grief. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video. Good night.